In the pine country of Arkansas, a truck full of German women rolled through an American gate expecting the worst. They were not listening for kindness. They were listening for dogs, for shouting, for the crack of a rifle butt against wood. Then the truck stopped, and from the long wooden mess hall came the smell of beef stew. Not thin soup, not punishment food. Beef stew, potatoes, onions, coffee, white bread cooling on metal trays. For women who had been taught that surrender meant disgrace, that America was savage, that enemy hands would strip them of every last piece of dignity. That smell was impossible. A guard opened the back of the truck and said one word in English. Careful. Not move, not faster. Careful. And that was the first crack in the world they had been trained to believe. By late 1945, Europe was no longer officially at war, but thousands of Germans were still living inside the wreckage it had left behind. Some were soldiers, some were medics, some were clerks, telephone operators, drivers and auxiliaries who had followed the German war machine until the machine broke underneath them. This small group of women had been captured in the chaos after the fighting moved west. They had crossed camps, ports, trains, and an ocean, carrying almost nothing. A photograph, a comb, a rosary hidden in a sock, a folded letter already too old to answer. Most of them were young enough to still remember school desks, old enough to have watched cities burn. They had heard stories all their lives. Americans were greedy. Americans were cruel. American soldiers had no honor. American women were shameless. American camps were places where prisoners disappeared. Propaganda had made the enemy simple, because fear works best when the person across from you has no human face. But when the truck doors opened, the women saw guards in rolled sleeves, rifles slung loose, standing in the heat with clipboards and canteens. One of the prisoners, a 23-year-old former Luftwaffe clerk named Lotta Brenner, climbed down slowly. Her knees trembled so hard, she thought the guard would laugh. He did not. He reached out one hand to steady her. That small gesture frightened her more than cruelty would have. Cruelty would have made sense. Kindness made no sense at all. The camp was built among pine trees and red dirt, a place of wire fences, wooden barracks, guard towers, wash sheds, and a mess hall that smelled better than any kitchen Lottie had entered in years. Cicadas buzzed in the trees. Trucks coughed diesel near the gate. Somewhere, an American radio played swing music so softly it sounded like memory coming from another country. The women were lined up for processing. No one dragged them. No one spat at them. A sergeant pointed to a shaded area and told the interpreter, "Have them wait there. It's too hot in the sun." The interpreter repeated it in German. Some of the women looked at one another as if they had misheard. A medic checked their wrists, their eyes, their temperature. Their names were written in a ledger. Each received a prisoner number, not as an insult, but as administration. The difference mattered. A number could erase you, or it could keep track of whether you had eaten, slept, and survived. On the barrack wall hung a posted translation of the camp rules. Prisoners of war would receive food, medical care, clothing, male privileges, humane treatment under the Geneva Convention. The women read the words in silence. One whispered, "They put this on the wall as if it is normal." For them, it was not normal. Normal had become sirens, hunger, rubble, ration cards, and officers who shouted until even obedience felt like fear. Normal was dark bread stretched with fillers, soup that barely changed color, and the quiet shame of being grateful for scraps. Now an American nurse came down the line with tin cups of water. Cold water, not warm from a barrel, cold. The first sip shocked them. Lot held the cup with both hands. The metal was dented and plain, but in that moment it felt like a thing from before the war, before everyone learned to count calories, matches, train schedules, and bodies. Nearby, a young guard from Oklahoma tried a sentence he had memorized. Guten Morgen. His accent was terrible. A few women stared. Then one of them laughed before she could stop herself. The guard smiled, embarrassed, and the laughter spread softly through the line. It was not friendship, not yet. It was only the sound of fear losing its grip for 1 second. But 1 second can be enough to let doubt enter. That evening, the women were shown their bunks, rows of narrow cots, folded blankets, a bar of soap on each mattress, a towel, a tin basin. Soap, that was the object that undid several of them. Not the wire, not the guards. Soap, scented, pale, ordinary soap from a country untouched by the kind of rationing that had reduced entire cities to gray. One woman pressed it to her nose and began to cry. The others looked away because hunger was humiliating enough. Cleanliness was worse. It reminded them they had once been daughters, students, wives, sisters, not just bodies pushed through the end of a losing war. Rain came after dark. The barrack roof clicked and whispered under it. The women lay awake, stiff under American blankets, waiting for the hidden cruelty to appear. A slap in the morning, an insult, a guard testing them. Some proof that the posters had been right. From across the yard they heard American soldiers laughing. Not cruel laughter, homesick laughter. One talked about a farm in Iowa, another about a baby he had not seen since she was born. Another complained that his mother's apple pie was better than anything the army cooked. Lotta turned toward the woman on the next cot and whispered, "They sound like boys from home." The woman did not answer. She was already crying into the blanket. Morning arrived with a whistle. The women lined up outside the barracks. The air smelled of damp pine, wet dirt, coffee, and something rich coming from the mess hall. The smell made them stand straighter, because hunger had taught them not to look hungry. But every face in that line noticed it. Beef, potatoes, bread. An American sergeant walked along the row with a clipboard. "Breakfast after work assignments," he said. The interpreter translated. Several women exchanged quick glances. Breakfast. Not a ration. Not a punishment. Breakfast. The work assignments came first. Kitchen detail, laundry, garden plots, sewing room, office cleaning. In many camps, German prisoners worked under American supervision, earning small credits for canteen items, repairing what the camp used, growing what the kitchen needed, and slowly entering a routine that felt less like captivity and more like a strange, fenced version of ordinary life. But the women had not reached ordinary yet. They were still waiting for the trick. A broad-shouldered cook stepped out of the kitchen doorway, wiping his hands on a white apron. His name was Walter Reeves, though the women only knew him as the large man with the ladle. He looked at the line of thin faces and said to the interpreter, "Tell them they'll eat in 10 minutes." The interpreter smiled. "They will feed us now," he said in German. No one moved. The cook frowned, confused, then lifted the lid from a black kettle. Steam rolled out. That was when discipline failed. Several women leaned forward without meaning to. One covered her mouth. Another shut her eyes, as if smell alone could be dangerous. When the doors opened, they entered the mess hall carefully, almost ceremonially. The room was plain. Long wooden tables, benches, metal trays, white enamel mugs, flies tapping the windows, guards behind a serving counter. It should not have felt holy, but hunger can turn a room with soup into a chapel. The first woman in line received a tray. A ladle sank into the stew and came up heavy with potatoes, carrots, gravy, and real pieces of meat. A slice of white bread went beside it. Then coffee, then a spoonful of applesauce. She stared at the tray. Is this for us? The interpreter nodded. For you. She still did not move. The guard behind the counter gently pushed the tray forward. Go ahead, Mom. Mom. The word passed through the line like an electrical current. These women had been shouted at by officers from their own side, ordered by men who used duty as a weapon, reduced by propaganda into symbols, breeders, helpers, servants of a collapsing dream, and now the enemy called one of them Mom over a plate of stew. Lottie received her tray and carried it to the bench with both hands. She sat down beside women who were trying not to shake. Nobody prayed. Nobody spoke. They were afraid that a word might break the spell. She lifted the spoon. The first bite was too hot. She did not care. The salt hit first, then fat, then onion, then the softness of potato against her tongue. It tasted less like food than permission. Permission to stop bracing. Permission to be hungry. Permission to live. Her eyes filled before she could stop them. Across the table, a former Army telephone operator named Elsa began to weep openly, one hand over her mouth, the other still holding the spoon. The cook watched from the counter. One soldier murmured, "They're crying over stew." Another answered, "Maybe that says more about the war than the stew." No one laughed. Walter Reeves came around with the kettle and spoke through the interpreter. "There is more." That sentence broke the room. More, not enough to survive. More, not thin enough to remind them who had power. More. Several women raised their bowls with a shame so deep it almost looked like apology. The cook filled them anyway. At the sink afterward, they washed their trays in warm water and found another small luxury waiting there. Soap again. Pale yellow bars stacked in a wooden box. One woman said, "I had forgotten what clean smelled like." Lottie remembered that sentence for the rest of her life, because it was not really about soap. It was about a country that had trained them to confuse hardness with strength, and then left them so broken that a bar of soap felt like mercy. That afternoon, the camp commander addressed them in the yard. He was not dramatic. He did not speak like a liberator. He sounded tired, practical, almost bored by decency. Through the interpreter, he said, "You are prisoners of war. You are not here for revenge. You will work. You will follow camp rules. You will receive food, medical care, and male privileges. No one here is permitted to abuse you. No one here is permitted to abuse you." The sentence unsettled them, because it made cruelty sound illegal, not normal. For years, they had been told law was whatever power declared it to be. Now the enemy was telling them that even prisoners had protections. Even defeated people had limits around them. Even women in enemy uniforms were not outside the human circle. That night, Lot opened the little notebook she had hidden inside her coat lining. She had not written in it since France. Her hand shook as she wrote one line. "They did not break us today. They fed us." Before that meal, their journey had already tested what they believed. The women had crossed the Atlantic in the belly of a converted troop ship. Steel bunks, salt air, seasick prisoners, Navy guards who looked too young to belong to any war. The ocean was so large that some of the women believed America might truly be another planet. In the hold, they traded rumors. They would be sent to factories. They would be placed on display. They would be punished for what Germany had done. They would never return. But the guards brought water, bread, medical checks, deck time when the weather allowed it. One sailor gave an extra apple to a woman who had not been able to stand after 3 days of sickness. He said, "Almost there." She did not know whether he meant land or peace. When the ship reached the American coast, the women pressed toward the rail and expected smoke, fortresses, rage. Instead, they saw docks, trucks, pine trees, small houses, and children waving from a distance. Children, waving, that ordinary gesture confused them more than barbed wire. The train inland confused them even more. Open windows, clean benches, guards passing sandwiches through the car, white bread with meat and mustard, coffee in paper cups. One woman whispered, "They give better food to prisoners than we gave to nurses." No one corrected her, because everyone knew it might be true. By the time they reached the Arkansas camp, fear had not disappeared, but it had changed shape. It was no longer a wall. It was a question. What if everything they had been told about the enemy was not just exaggerated, but wrong? And if that was wrong, what else was wrong? That question did not arrive all at once. It came in pieces. A cup of water, a guard saying please, a medic checking a fever, a cook offering seconds, a posted rule in German, a letter form placed on a bunk, a bar of soap. The camp became a slow machine for dismantling certainty, not through lectures, through routine. Roll call at sunrise, kitchen smoke, laundry steam, garden rows cut into red soil, canteen tokens, mail inspections, chapel benches, English lessons. The women were still prisoners. The fence never let them forget that. A guard tower stood over the yard. Counts were taken. Rules were enforced. Letters were censored. Freedom was limited to the length of a path between barracks and work sheds. But inside those limits, something strange began to happen. They recovered. Their faces filled out. Their hands stopped trembling. Women who had walked into camp with gray skin began to look their age again. Some gained weight and felt guilty for it. Some hid extra bread in their pockets out of habit, even after they understood the next meal would come. Hunger does not vanish when food appears. It watches from inside you. During the second week, the camp announced male privileges. Each prisoner received one sheet of paper, one envelope, and a pencil. The rules were printed clearly. No military secrets, no coded messages, no threats. Censors would read everything, but they were allowed to write home. At first, no one knew how to begin. What could they say to families living in smashed cities and hungry villages? "I am alive." That was the first sentence on almost every page. Then the second sentence became harder. "The Americans treat us fairly." Some stopped there and stared at the line, afraid their mothers would not believe it. Then came details. "We sleep in beds. We receive coffee. There is meat in the stew. The bread is white. The nurses gave us soap. The guards do not shout." Those sentences were dangerous, in a way propaganda could not survive. They were too small to look political, too ordinary to feel like an argument, but each one carried a truth sharper than a speech. The enemy had not become a monster when given power. The enemy had set rules around power. Letters left the camp in bundles, passed through censors, stamped, routed across oceans and ruined borders. Some took months, some never arrived. But when replies came back, the women read them until the creases split. "The house is gone, but we live. Your brother has not returned. Your father is ill. There is little food. Come home if they let you. Each reply brought home closer and made camp comfort more painful. Marta, a former Red Cross aide, folded one letter 3 times, then opened it again and again until the pencil marks faded at the corners. My mother is eating potato peels, she said one evening. No one answered. They were sitting outside the mess hall with full stomachs. That was the cruelest kindness of all. To be safe while home was starving. To be fed by the enemy while your own country lay broken by the leaders who had promised glory. Comfort became evidence, and evidence became accusation. Not against the Americans, against the lie. The camp officers did not need to tell the women that the Reich had deceived them. The women discovered it by comparing one day to the next. American newspapers in the library showed photographs they had not been allowed to see. Destroyed German cities, camps liberated in Europe, refugees moving down roads with bundles, leaders gone, flags torn down. The scale of ruin was no longer a rumor. At first, some refused to look, others looked too long. Elsa stared at one newspaper photograph until her eyes hardened. They told us sacrifice would make the nation pure, she said. Then she tapped the picture of rubble. This is what purity looks like? No one told her to lower her voice. That freedom startled her too. In the sewing room, the women repaired uniforms and blankets. In the laundry, they scrubbed shirts in hot water and hung them under pine branches. In the gardens, they planted beans, cabbage, onions, and potatoes for the camp kitchen. The work was controlled, but it had purpose. It made the day move. It gave their hands something to do besides clutch letters. By winter, the gardens had helped stock the kitchen. The sewing room had repaired thousands of pieces of clothing. The laundry ran so efficiently that one American officer joked the camp was better organized than his mother's boarding house. The women laughed because they finally understood enough English to catch the joke. That was another crack, language. The first words they learned were practical. Water, bread, soap, work, mail, thank you. Then came harder words. Home, sorry, tomorrow, safe. The word safe remained the strangest. They were prisoners, but they were safe. They were fenced in, but they were not being hunted. They were defeated, but they were not being erased. An English teacher from the Army chaplain's office began holding classes twice a week. Attendance was voluntary. At first, women came for curiosity, then for the warmth of the classroom stove, then because language gave them a small feeling of control. The teacher wrote phrases on a board. Good morning, I understand. Please repeat. My name is. The women practiced, laughed at themselves, and corrected each other. One day, Lot said in careful English, My name is Lotte Brenner. The room clapped. She blushed so deeply she covered her face. It was not a heroic moment. That was why it mattered. War had made everything huge, abstract, and impossible. Nations, flags, orders, fronts, surrender. But recovery came through small sentences. My name is. I am alive. There is more stew. Winter made the camp smaller. Cold pressed the women indoors. Smoke drifted from stovepipes. Snow dusted the barrack roofs and turned the wire fences pale. At night, the guard towers looked less like threats and more like black shapes, holding still against the sky. The distance between guards and prisoners began to narrow in ways nobody officially named. A guard named Frank loaned his gloves to an older woman during roll call when he saw her fingers blue with cold. He pretended it was nothing. A nurse found extra cough syrup for a prisoner who could not sleep. Walter Reeves saved the heel ends of fresh loaves for the women who worked late in the kitchen. Small mercies can become dangerous because they demand a response, not obedience, recognition. The women began to recognize the guards as men with homes, jokes, bad German, and grief of their own. Some had lost friends in Europe. Some had seen German weapons tear open men they loved. Some had guarded prisoners by day and written letters to widows by night. Kindness did not mean the Americans had forgotten the war. It meant they refused to become what the war had asked them to be. One December evening, the Red Cross helped arrange a small music program in the recreation hut. The stove smoked. The benches creaked. A soldier brought a harmonica. Someone suggested a Christmas song. At first, the women sat stiffly. Then the harmonica began. Silent night. The melody crossed the room before the words did. One German voice joined. Then another. The Americans sang in English. The women sang in German. 2 languages. One song. For 3 minutes, the camp forgot what uniforms had done to the world. When the final note faded, no one clapped right away. The silence held too much. A sergeant near the door wiped his eyes quickly, hoping no one had seen. Everyone had seen. No one mentioned it. After that night, the change became easier to admit. Not simple. Never simple. Some women still carried shame so heavy it made kindness feel undeserved. Marta once said, "My brother died in the snow. I should not be warm here," Lotta answered. Maybe being warm is how you learn not to send another brother into snow. It was not enough, but it was something. The camp chaplain wrote in a report that fear had given way to discipline, then discipline to trust. He did not call it friendship. That would have been too clean. He called it evidence of restored humanity. Restored, not invented, not gifted by the Americans as if they owned it. Restored, as if the war had buried something under rubble and ordinary decency had begun to dig it out. In early 1946, inspectors arrived. The women watched them walk through the mess hall, clinic, barracks, kitchens, and work sheds with notebooks, food supply, hygiene, medical treatment, male procedures, labor conditions, everything measured, everything recorded. The visit mattered because it proved the rules were not decoration. The Geneva Convention poster was not only on the wall, it had reached the kitchen, the clinic, the laundry, the mail room, the spoon. That was the part the women could not stop thinking about. Law was not grand when they first felt it. It was a full bowl placed in front of a defeated person. It was a guard stepping back. It was a doctor treating a fever without asking what uniform the patient had worn. It was a censor cutting out forbidden lines. It was power choosing a limit. By spring, release orders began to arrive. At first, the news moved quietly. Names on lists, transport dates, medical clearances, bags brought down from bunks, returned library books, folded blankets, scrubbed floors. Then the emotion came. Joy because they might see home. Fear because home was no longer guaranteed to exist. Germany had not been waiting unchanged. It was broken, occupied, hungry, divided by suspicion and ash. Some families were alive. Some were missing. Some women would return to streets with no house numbers left to guide them. Lot wrote in her notebook, "I am going home to a place that may not remember me." On the final evening, the mess hall served stew, the same kind as the first meal. Beef, potatoes, carrots, bread, coffee. But the room was different now. No one stared at the tray as if it might vanish. No one expected humiliation. The women ate slowly because they understood they were not only tasting supper. They were tasting the beginning and the end of their captivity at once. Walter Reeves came out from behind the counter. He was embarrassed by farewell speeches, so he did not make one. He placed extra bread on the table and said, "For the trip," the interpreter translated. Several women stood. One by one, they thanked him in English. "Thank you, Mr. Reeves. Thank you for food. Thank you for kindness." He looked down at his apron and nodded, because the room had become too much for him. The next morning, before sunrise, trucks waited near the gate. The women carried small bundles, notebooks, letters, soap saved from the camp store, and chocolate bars given quietly by guards who pretended they were not gifts. The camp commander stood near the gate and addressed them one last time. "You came here as prisoners," he said, through the interpreter. "You leave under orders for home. What happened here does not erase what happened in the war. But remember this: peace begins in the way people choose to hold power." Lotte looked at the fence. The first day, it had looked like the edge of the world. Now it looked like something more complicated. It had held her prisoner. It had also kept her alive long enough to understand what the war had stolen from her. As the truck rolled out, the American flag moved lightly in the cold morning air. The guard tower shrank behind the pine trees. The mess hall disappeared last. For weeks afterward, the women traveled by train and ship back toward Europe. The Atlantic was still gray. The bunks were still narrow. But they were not the same women who had crossed it months before. They had seen the enemy feed them. They had heard the enemy sing with them. They had learned that law could protect the defeated, that kindness could exist without surrendering strength, and that propaganda could collapse under the weight of one ordinary meal. When they reached Germany, the truth of home struck them harder than any camp gate. Streets broken open. Children with hollow cheeks. Women trading jewelry for potatoes. Men missing limbs, names, or hope. Some families welcomed them back. Some asked questions. Some did not want to hear that Americans had been decent, because grief often needs an enemy to stay simple. But the women told the story anyway, not always loudly, not always at once. They told it while sharing bread, while washing clothes, while working in clinics, schools, relief offices, and kitchens. They told it to mothers who had lost sons, to younger sisters who had grown up on slogans, to children who only knew Americans as uniforms and trucks. They said, "I was afraid of them." They said, "They fed us." They said, "The first time I believed the war was truly over was not when I saw a flag come down. It was when an American guard called me mom." Years later, some of those women still remembered the exact smell of that first bowl. Not because stew was rare in history, but because mercy is easiest to deny when it stays abstract. A treaty is paper. A speech is air. A policy can be dismissed, but a hungry person remembers who handed her the spoon. More than Bonchamnan German prisoners passed through camps in the United States during the war years. Most were men. Some worked fields, repaired equipment, wrote letters, attended classes, and returned to a ruined homeland with stories that did not fit the propaganda they had been given. The system was not perfect, and captivity was still captivity. But in those camps, the decision to follow rules when hatred would have been easier became its own kind of victory. Not a victory of tanks, not a victory of flags, a quieter victory. The victory of refusing to let the enemy decide what kind of people you become. Lotte kept one object from Arkansas for the rest of her life. Not a uniform patch, not a camp notice. A small spoon from the mess hall, dull and scratched, wrapped in cloth. When her granddaughter once asked why she had saved it, Lade did not begin with politics. She did not explain treaties or armies. She did not defend herself. She held the spoon in her palm and remembered pine trees, wet gravel, a wooden table, a bowl too hot to touch, and a word she had not expected from the other side of the war. Careful. Then she said, "This was the first thing that made me doubt the hate. A bowl of stew did not erase the war. It proved the lie had lost.